Today's daf. This is the daf for Sunday, June 2nd. And today's daf, hopefully recording it, hearing it on the right time. Today's daf is daf Sadi Hey, 95 in Masechet Bava Metzia. Apologize for my voice. I'll try to be clear. But we discussed yesterday, we started a new parak, Shoel Tapara, and we started discussing how we learn from a previous Mishnah the different chiyuvim of the three categories of shomrim. So there's a shoel who borrowed it, who's chayav for everything we said, a shomer sachar and a socher who are chayav for gnevav avidah. If it gets stolen or lost, they have to pay. But if it's an ones, and we learned yesterday, that means nishbar, nishba umet. It got injured on its own. It died or it got captured. Then you're patur, and a shomer chinam, person is watching it for free, who is patur for all of that, but he would have to make a shvuah about what happened in order to be patur. So that's what we started discussing yesterday, and deriving from the three sets of psukim in Parshat Mishpatim. Today's Gemara starts by continuing that derivation. We are on Daf Tzadi Hayam and Aleph, 3 lines from the top. Says the Gemara, look. It says in the Torah that a shoel, if you borrow an animal, v'nishbar omet, right? It says, and if it breaks or dies, then you have to pay. Ask the Gemara 4 lines from the top, the first word on the line, what about gnevav aveda? Right? We took for granted that if you pay for an onus, you for sure pay if it's stolen or lost, which is not an onus, it's not unforced, right? So it's partly your fault, let's say, right? You should have watched it better, you should have protected it better. So there you have to pay. But how do you know that? It doesn't say in the Torah. So if you borrow someone else's cow and it gets stolen, how do you know you have to pay? It says what you're going to say, it's obvious. That you learn it from essentially a kal v'chomer, from shvura and meita. You have to pay for things that are an onus, right? It broke or it died. So certainly you have to pay if it was stolen. It says, remember, that's not so clear. Because it might be that the reason you have to pay for something that was shvura umeta and therefore it broke or died is because right? The reason is that it's no longer able to ever return this back to the owner in its original form. It's damaged. But maybe you don't have to pay for something that was stolen or lost because it might come back. You might find the ganav or find the object. You can work hard. Maybe someone can, and find it. Ella, ki hadatanya. The fact is, the way we know it is from the Braita says, v'nishmar omet, it says by a shoel, that you have to pay if it is broken or dead. It says the Braita, so I only know from there that you have to pay for an onus. How do I know that a shoel has to pay for stolen and lost? Here's the kal v'chomer. Not from the shvar omet, but from shomer sachar. Shomer sachar, the middle level of shomer sachar, who's clearly patur mishvura meita. The Torah says that you're patur for an onus, but you're chayav b'gnevav aveda. You have to pay if it's stolen or lost. So shoel shechayav b'shvura umeita, a shoel is chayav for onus, and din shechayav b'gnevav aveda. It says the Braita zehu kal v'chomer she'en lav tshuva. This is a great kal v'chomer. Don't ask any questions. So somewhere, of course, every time you say that, someone was starting to ask a question. What do you mean, my ina love tshuva? What would have been the question on the kal v'chomer? Because you might have said, I can uproot, I can question your kal v'chomer, because I can say that mala shomer sachar. You're saying that everything that applies to a shomer sachar for sure applies to a shoel, because shomer sachar is less responsible than a shoel. But there are one situation where shomer sachar is chayav, where shoel is not chayav. And that was the situation we talked about yesterday in a shomer chinam, shomer sachar strategy, where if you are patur for something, but you lie about it, right? So you're patur for onus, if you're a shomer sachar. If you say, oh, an onus happened to this thing, and it turns out you were lying, then if it's about it being stolen, you might have to pay kefil. So since there's a scenario where shomer sachar pays kefil, they, in some ways, are stricter than shoel, who never pays kefil. Right? And says the Gemara, let's read that inside. You could have asked, maybe, if you had thought, maybe there's a question on this kal v'chomer, because mala shomer sachar, who says the shomer sachar is so chamor? Maybe, I'm sorry, who says the shomer sachar is so kal? maybe it's more chomer. Shekim mishalim tashlumi kefal between tanat listim mizuyim. Right? Remember, we said this yesterday about Shomer Chinam, about Geneva. But if a Shomer Sachar says, look, an armed robber came and stole this thing. So although a Shomer Sachar is chai for Geneva, you're not chai for armed robbery because you couldn't have stopped that, right? There's nothing, you're not expected to stop it. So that's essentially an onus. However, it's still stealing, right? And if it turns out that you're lying, they say, okay, swear that that happened, and you swear, and then they find it in your basement, you'd have to pay kefil, right? So therefore, maybe a shomer sachar is more chamor. So as we said yesterday, it's true that there is a small scenario in which a shomer sachar pays kefil, but most of the time he pays nothing, right? And a shoel pays the principal. Karna de shoel adifa. The fact that the shoel pays the principal is stricter, is a more stringency about a shoel. So therefore, you can make that kal v'chomer. Or else it's possible to say, remember there's a machloket we had earlier about whether listim mizuyim are called a ganav, and therefore you pay kefil if you lie about it, or a gazlan. Because remember, the difference between ganav and gazlan is when they hide their identity. So listim mizuyim is actually considered to be a gazlanhu. They're considered to be a gazlan, and therefore, even if you make a claim and you're lying, you only pay principal. You don't even pay kefil, because remember, by a gazlan, you don't pay kefil. So it could be it's not a question because it never exists. But either way, that is the kal v'chomer that teaches us that since a shomer sachar has to pay for gnivav aveda, a shoel has to pay for gnivav aveda also. Says the Gemara, okay, ashchan chiyuv. So we found that a shoel has to pay if something went wrong. But again, remember that there's an exception in the Torah that says if the owner is with you, you don't pay. But that it says in the shoel's case by what the shoel is chayav for. How do you know the ftur minalan? How do you know that if the owner is with you, you're putter if you're a shoel from gneva aveda, really from anything? Says somewhere, well, why don't you say it's logical, right? Torah says that if you're a shoel, you're chayav for an onus, for shvura ameta. And the Torah says, but if the owner's with you at the time that you borrow it, you're not chai for those things. So if you're chai for gneva v'mida and the owner's with you, you should be patur for that too. What if you say nelef mishvura umeda? Say, well, since you're chai for shvura umeda, but you're patur if the owner's with you, you should also be patur for gneva v'mida if the owner's with you. So that's not a good proof because maybe malash shvura umeda. Maybe the only reason you're patur if the owner's with you by shvura umeda, she can't onus. Because it's an onus. You couldn't have avoided it, right? So therefore, the Torah didn't require you. It said, look, you have to pay in general. If the owner is with you, the owner takes some responsibility. They're watching it too. It's their problem. But how do you know by Gneva Vaveda, where you really should be able to do something to watch the thing so it doesn't get stolen or lost? How do we know that if the owner is with you at the time you borrow it, they are also pater? Ella, the way we know is Gamar Mishomer Sachar. We in fact learn it from a Shomer Sachar. That Shomer Sachar is chai for Gneva Vaveda, but they're pater if the owner's with them. So too by a Shoel, you are chai for Gneva Vaveda, but you are pater if the owner is with you, right? Where are we? Gemara Mishomer Sachar says, well, it's an interesting point because the Torah only says it by a Shoel. So Shomer Sachar Gufe Minolan, right? The pasuk that says that your pater if the owner is with you is written by a Shoel. So how do you know that it's true by Shomer Sachar? If a person is being paid to watch something and the owner is helping them, right? You watch my cow. I can't do it on my own. I'll give you $50 to watch it. And I say to them, okay, but I want you to come with the cow and you help me guide it, right? So that's the owner working with the Shomer Sachar. How do you know that in that case, if it gets stolen, the Shomer Sachar, who would usually be chayiv, is now patur? Says where Shomer Sachar gufa minalan. Well, the way we know that is by its logic. We take the parallel. The case where Shomer Sachar is chayav, Gneva Vaveda, is similar to the case where Shoel is chayav, which is ones, right? And just like malahalan, just like by shoel beba'alim patur, if the owner is with you when you borrow it, you're patur. Afkan by shomer sachar, if the owner is with you beba'alim patur. Well, explain this to me. What halachic tool or what Gemara, let's say, tool are you using to derive that shomer sachar is same as a shoel? B'may gamar. What's the tool you use to compare those two things? If it's a mamatzino is a rather straightforward thing where you say, well, you found it in one case, so it should be similar in the other case. So that is true. You found it by a shoel. You're saying it by a shomer sachar, but ikal mifrach. But you can always ask a question on that. Kidei parchinan, as we just asked earlier, which is saying shekain onis. By a shoel, you're chayav by an onis. So maybe that because that's such a unavoidable thing. If the owner's with you, you'd be patur. But a shomer sachar is chayav for gniva v'aveda. You should do something about that. You should not let it be stolen. You should not let it be lost. So how do you know you're patur just because the owners are with you? You're right. We can't do it from Mamatzino. You have to do it from a extra word or extra letter, in this case, in the pasuk. Ella, you know how we know it? Amar Kra. You look back in Mishpatim, remember the three sections. One is Shomer Chinam, then Shomer Sachar, and then Shoel. But the pasuk that begins the story of Shoel tells you, V'chi yish'al, ishmi imre'eo. When a person borrows, but it doesn't say ki, when, it says virki, and when. And the vav is telling you that and this parsha has connections to the previous section, which was Shomer Sachar. So vav mosif al inyan rishon, vav adds to the previous thing, to Shomer Sachar, v'yomod al yom mitachton. You learn some halachot of Shomer Sachar from the bottom, which is Shoel. And what do you learn? You learn that by Shoel, if the owner's with you, you're patur. And so too by Shomer Sachar, if the owner's with you, you'd be patur. So it's an extra pasuk, extra word in the pasuk. Says Gemara, okay. So I've learned that by Shoel, I didn't learn. The Torah says by Shoel, if you borrow and the owner's with you, you're patur. We learned from the vav that by Shomer Sachar, usually you're chai for gneva v'aveda, but you'd be patur if the owner's with you. How do you know, Akati? How do you know that a shoel is patur on gneva v'aveda if the owner's with you? Right? So we said we learned it from shoel, from shomer sachar. Asking where Akati, we are the sixth to last narrow line. Akati shoel mi shomer sachar lo gamar. But how can I learn the shoel by gneva v'aveda from shomer sachar? Ikal mirfrach, because you can ask that maybe shmal shomer sachar shkem patur b'shvura meita. A shomer sachar is patur for an onis. So maybe they too are patur if it got stolen and the owner was with them. They don't have as much responsibility. Tomer b'shoel, but you can't say that it's necessarily the same by a shoel who's chayav b'shvura meita. They have more responsibilities. Ella says, Gemara, you're right. You know, what I would say is, we're again 3 lines from the last narrow line. Gneva va'aveda b'shoel l'chiyuva minalan. How do I know, right? This is what we learned earlier today's daf. How do I know that a shoel is even chayav for gneva va'aveda? It doesn't say it in the Torah. How did you learn it? You learned it, gamar mishomer sachar. The whole source that a shoel, that a borrower is chayav for gneva va'aveda, was because of a kal v'chomer from shomer sachar. That a shoel is chayav in ones, a shomer sachar is patur in ones. So one is kal, one is chamor, and a shomer sachar is chayav for gneva v'aveda. So certainly a shoel is chayav for gneva v'aveda. But since a shomer sachar is the source, we have a principle, of course, of dayo lavo min hadin liot knidon. It's enough. It's all you can do from a kal v'chomer is to be like the thing you're comparing it to. And ma gneva v'aveda. Shomer Sachar b'ba'alim patur. We just derived from the vav that a shomer sachar who's chayav for gneva v'aveda is patur if the owner's with you. So too, if that's the source that a shoel is chayav, it can't be more extreme than the thing you learned it from. Af gneva v'aveda the shoel nami b'ba'alim patur. So that is the way. It's because we only know it from a kal v'chomer, and there's a principle of dayo lavo min hadin liot knidon. It's enough. It's all you're allowed to do from a kal v'chomer is learn that it's similar to the thing you're comparing it to. Therefore, you are patur if you're a shoel if the owners are with you. First wide line. It says Marhani Chamanda Itli Dayo. Now that principle though is subject to some debate. It's not so clear. It discusses a little bit that in fact there is an opinion that you don't have dayo, but the Gemara is using this for argument's sake, let's say. So hanicha, that makes sense. The itle dayo, according to the Tana who holds that you say that you can only learn from a kal v'chomer as much as the thing that you derived it from. Elamanda letle dayo, but if you don't hold of that principle, ma'ikal meimar. So then, how do you know again that the shoel is patur if the owner is with him or her? Ella Amarkra, you know how we learn it? Go back to that pasuk of the Vav. It says B'chi Yish'al, and we said before, B'chi Yish'al is saying and if you borrow. That Vav, Mosif al Inyan Rishon. The Vav combines the Shomer Sachar to the next category of Shoel, and it adds halachot, right? So before we said Yomon El Yomi Tachton, we learned out the top thing, meaning the top is looking at a scroll of the Torah. So the higher, the first parsha, Shomer Sachar, from the bottom, from Shoel. But you know what we do? We now go backwards. We learn Tachton Mi El Yon. We learn one halacha of Shomer Sachar from Shoel that you're chayv for, your potter, sorry, Balim Imo, the owner's with you. And we derive a second halacha from Shoel, from Shomer Sachar, that you're patur if the owners are with you for Gneva Avida. Itmar. Fourth wide line, sorry. The next case is, what if you are poshea, right? So we just learned that with Torah says that if an onus happens and the owner is with you, you're patur. We just learned from a pasuk that if you're shomer sachar and you get stolen and the owner's with you, you're patur. What if you're a shomer chinam, or anyone for that matter, and you are poshea? You're being paid or you're being asked to watch something, sorry, and you're totally negligent. You don't close the door, you let it run away, but the owners happen to be with you. Is that enough to make you patur, right? Pshi'a b'ba'alim, if you are poshea, but the owners are with you, there, Pligi bar Ravacha v'Ravina. Ravacha and Ravina, two Amoraim, argued about the halacha. Chana Amar Chayav. One said that's an exception. If the owners are with you, it doesn't matter. You still have to watch it. And if you're posheh, you're chayav. And Chana Amar Patur. And one said no, that just like all other chiyuvim, you're chayav in general. But if the owners are with you, you're always patur. Manda Amar Chayav, the one at Tanu, the Amor, sorry, who said you're chayav. Kasavar, look. The Torah is basically comparing with the Vav, the Chiyishal, Shoel to Shomer Sachar. But you can't go backwards to the first parsha. Remember the three parshiot, Shomer Chinam, Shomer Sachar, and Shoel. You can't go backwards and say the Shoel is similar to the second previous, the penultimate parsha of Shomer Chinam. So Mikra Nidrash Lefanav, the Torah tells you to darshan to the one before, but not Lefnei Fanav, not two back. Hilkach, in Balavimo, a Shomer Chinam Loktiv. When it says Balavimo by Shoel, it applies to Shomer Sachar, but it does not apply to Shomer Chinam. Upshia nami, and if you in general the concept that you're chayiv for pshia b'shomer sachar v'shoel lo k'tiv doesn't ever say that by shomer sachar v'shoel, right? We derive it from hilkach. How do we know b'shomer sachar v'shoel chiyuv? How do we know that a shomer sachar and a shoel are chayiv for pshia? That we learn from a kal v'chomer ati mikal v'chomer b'shomer chinam, right? The shomer chinam was pater on Gneva Vavida is chayiv for pshia, so kal v'chomer a shomer sachar and a shoel. But we never learned that Ba'alav Imo would be patur, right? Ava b'Ba'alim liftor, but if you're talking about being patur with the owners, af b'shomer sachar b'shoel lo, right? You are not, because my taima, kiktiv im Ba'alav Imo lo yishalim ashoel. Shomer sachar, when it says by shoel, and we learned earlier from the Vav, and a shomer sachar is included in that, when it says v'chi, when it says, sorry, that in Balav Yimo that you're patur, right? It doesn't say it by it's not referring to the chiyuv of pshia, right? So therefore, it's only referring ahanach chiyuva d'chtiv bohu behedyehu d'michtav. It's only referring to the chiyuv that the Torah speaks out, which is onus by a shoel, gneva v'aveda by shomer sachar. In those cases, if the owner is with you, you're patur, but by a shoel, by pshia, you would be chayav. That is one opinion. We don't know which Amor holds that. That's one opinion. Manda Amar Patur, the other Amor says that you're Patur, even if you have a Pshia, as long as the owners are with you, right? I keep losing my place. 4 lines in the bottom. Kasavar, that the Amor holds that Mikra Nidrash the Fanav, the Vav combines the Parsha of Shoel to the one before it, and Lifnei Fanav, and the one before it, meaning two back. When it says in Ba'alav Imo by Shoel, the Torah says apply this to Shomer Sachar and a Shomer Chinam Namiktiv, and apply it to a Shomer Chinam. So therefore, Halacha Ba'alav Imo would apply in all cases, and we don't have a resolution yet. We're going to try to prove this, of course, from our Mishnah. So it's not. Let's try to prove it from our Mishnah, 3 lines from the bottom. Our Mishnah yesterday said, Hashoel HaPara, a person borrows a cow, V'sha'al Ba'ala Ima, and at the same time that you borrow the cow, you borrow the owners. Or Shoel Parav L'Sachar Ba'ala, you rent the owners. Or Sha'al Ba'ala Schar. In the second case of the Mishnah was you first borrow or rent the owner, and Achar Kach Sha'al Para, then you borrow his animal, and Meita, and the animal dies, you're patur. Okay, now Meita means, remember Shomer Sachar is chayav for Shoel, is chayav for Meita, right? But it doesn't say anything about a Shomer Chinam. It only says if you borrow. It doesn't say if you are watching it. Ilo shomer chinam lo katani. Well, that's not a very good proof because it doesn't say shomer sachar either. And we already derived, according to everybody, that the shomer sachar does have a patur of ba'alav imo. L'tamech says the Gemara last line. Shomer sachar nami mikatani. Doesn't say in the Mishnah shomer sachar. Ela tana milta d'chtiva bikra. Right? The Torah, the Tana picks the example of Shoel not because it's the only case, but because that's what the Torah says. It's the one that's written in the Torah, right? The Ati Midrasha, look at he didn't tell you the one that we learned from Midrasha, but it doesn't prove to me that we don't learn out Shomer Chinam the same way we learned out Shomer Sachar. So now second line, of Daf, Study Hayam Babet, Tashma. Let's try to prove it from the following Braita. There's a Braita that elaborates on our Mishnah. What does the Braita say? Tashma. Sha'ala, let's say you borrow an animal, sha'abala ima, and you borrow its owner with it. Or schara, you rent an animal, schar bala ima. Or you mix them up. Sha'ala, you borrow the animal, but you rent the owner, schar bala ima. Or you rent the animal and you borrow the owner, schara v'sham bala ima. In all these cases, says the Braita, afa pisha habalim osim lacha b'makom acher. Even though the owners are working now in another place, now we don't exactly know what that means yet, but presumably you borrowed the owner to help you with your harvest. You also borrowed his cow to help with the harvest, right? So you are working the cow and he's in the field gathering up the things you plowed, let's say, harvested, right? So even though the owner is not with you, but because you borrowed the services of the owner at the same time, umeita, if the animal drops dead, you're patur, right? That's ba'alavimo. Now, says let's try to unpack this Braita. Savrua Hamani. Who is the author of this Braita? It's Rabbi Yehuda. It's probably Rabbi Yehuda who says, remember, there was a debate earlier between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda about what is the status of a socher. Is a socher like a shomer sachar or a socher like a shomer chinam? So we assume, because this is how we usually assume, that the ton of this Braita is Rabbi Yehuda. It's Rabbi Yehuda. The Amar socher kishomer sachar dam, right? And therefore, and so now this Braita then isn't talking about a socher who is a shomer sachar. So it's saying two cases, borrowing and shomer sachar, but it's conspicuously leaving out shomer chinam. So, and now you can't say it says what's written in the Torah because socher is not written in the Torah. So hi Tana katani milta da'ati midrasha. Clearly, unlike our Mishnah, this Tana is saying things that we learn from Midrasha, shomer sachar, which is shoel, v'ilo shomer chinam lo katani, but he conspicuously leaves out shomer chinam. So clearly, this halacha does not apply to shomer chinam. Answers Gemara Hamani. I got a great answer for you. The Tana of the Braita is Rabbi Meir. It could be Rabbi Meir who says that shomer socher, the Amar socher kishomer chinam dami. The socher, in fact, is a shomer chinam, and therefore the Braita is actually saying a person who's a borrower and a shomer chinam. The Tana shomer chinam v'hadin shomer sachar, and we don't even need to say shomer sachar because that's for sure. So therefore, it's not a proof. Or by them, you can also answer that, and we said many times already. Right? Remember the way Rabbi Baravu switched it up, and he said that in fact a socher ketza mishalem. How much does a socher pay? Is it like a shomer sachar or a shomer chinam? And Rabbi Meir is the one who says shomer sachar, and Rabbi Yehuda is the one who says shomer chinam. And so therefore, even though if you say the Braita is like Rabbi Yehuda holds it's a shomer chinam. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, this Braita could in fact just be saying that everybody is patur if the owner is with you, whether you're a shoel, a shomer sachar, or a shomer chinam. That is possible, and therefore you cannot prove another way from the Braita. So we do not have a conclusion. Continues the Gemara with Rav Hamnuna. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Hamnuna, where are we up to? I don't know, 10 lines from the top, we're still in the middle of the narrow line. Says Rav Hamnuna, who's an Amar, remember, a very radical statement. Says Rav Hamnuna, Amar Rav Hamnuna, the Torah says that you're patur if the owner is with you, but don't get too excited. There are limitations on that patur. The olam hu chayav. In fact, the borrower is chayav if the animal drops dead. Ad shetehei para v'choreshba. It has to be that you not only have borrowed a cow, but you borrowed the owner to be the one plowing with the cow. I mean, the owner has to physically be doing the work with the cow when it dies. Or chamar u'mechamer acharei. You borrowed a chamar, a donkey, and the owner is actually guiding it. That's how you work a donkey. You guide it. Not only do the owners have to be working the animal, They have to be with you constantly from the moment you borrowed it until the moment it dies. If they come and they leave it overnight, and then the next day they come back and they're working with it and it dies, maybe it's something you did overnight. The owners were not fully committed and responsible the whole time. So Alma, Kasafar, what Rav Hamnuna holds is Ba'alav Imo means literally the owner is with you. Akula milta mashma. The owner is 100% committed. They are with the animal, then you're a putter, which makes a little bit of sense, but is not going to be consistent with the Braita. Mativ Rava. Now Rava asked Rav Hamnuna, what about the Braita we just quoted? We just quoted a Braita that says, now we're quoting it again, Sha'ala v'sha'al ba'ala ima, right? You borrowed the animal, you borrowed the owner with it. Sorry, this is our the Braita. You borrowed it, you borrowed the owner. Schara v'sachar bala ima. Schara sha'al bala ima. Sha'ala schar bala ima. Any arrangement of borrowing, renting the animal and the owner. Said the Braita, Afa pisha ba'alim osim melacha b'makom acher u'meita patur. Even if the owners are working somewhere else, you're patur. That goes exactly like Rav Hamnuna, right? My love, the owner is doing something else. You borrowed the animal. You're, like I said, you're plowing with it. You're harvesting with it. You're pulling down the grain. Let's say, if you can harvest that way, and the owner's in the storehouse, stacking boxes. So you're patur, even though they're not working with you. My love, melacha acheret. Answers Rav Hamnuna, no. What the Braita is referring to is the owner has to be doing the same melacha, but odom melacha. So what does it say? You're somewhere else. How can you be doing the same melacha? Elamai makom acher to come merapiv azu kama. It's talking about where he basically is weaken. Merapiv means to loosen, right? To weaken something that you're basically. Let's say you're plowing. The borrower is pulling the cow, right, or riding the cow if you ride it. The owner is 100 feet in front of him, preparing the land to be plowed. So he's not physically with the animal, but he's doing the exact same melacha. They're part of the same work team. And that's where Rav Hamnuna says you are chayav. That's a little far-fetched, because if you keep going in the Braita, which we didn't read yet, Hamidiktani Seifa, Hamid Seifa, in the end, the second case in the Braita, which we're about to read, is referring to a case where you're al gaba hafi, where you're actually on the animal, meaning right with it. And the Braita will say that you're putter, that you're chayiv, sorry, there. We'll see why, because the order was not done. You borrowed it first and then borrowed the owner. But from the fact that the Seifa is specifically talking about a case where the owner is with the animal, working with it, it must be that Reisham and in fact, the Reish is referring to when the owner was working with you but doing something else, and the Braita says you're putter, which goes against Rav Hamnuna. What's the Seifa? The Ketani Seifa. Quotes the Seifa now. Sha'Allah, let's say you switch the order. You first borrow the animal, or ima, says the Braita, even if the owner's literally plowing on top of the animal, right next to it, umeta, and the animal dies, you are chayav, because since you didn't borrow the animal with the owner borrowed the owner later, you're chayav. So now, that is clearly talking about a case where the owner is on the animal or next to the animal. So when the Reisha said that you're doing something else, it implies you're really doing something else. Says Rav Hamnuna Amri, you know what Rav Hamnuna would tell you? That, in fact, Reisha, the Seifa are talking about, Reisha and Seifa are talking about the Otomalacha. In fact, both the first case of the Braita and the second case of the Braita, where the owner is working with the borrower in the same act, in the plowing process. Okay, we are 4 lines from the wide lines. Now the 5th line, first word on the line. But still, there's chidushim, right? The Reisha is still telling you something innovative, and Sefer Rabuta Kamashmalan, the Sefer is telling you something innovative. What is that? Reisha Rabuta Kamashmalan, the Afagav. Even though the lav al gaba, even though the owner is not actually physically with the animal, but he's still working in the same plowing process. He's loosening the field 50 yards ahead. But he's working in the same crew. Then kivan the havi ba'alim b'shat sheila patur, right? Then you're patur. That's according to Rav Hamnuna's pshat, because the owners are with you when you borrowed it. And Sefer Rabuta Kamashmalan, the Sefer is telling you that, look, even though you're physically next to the animal, afagav al gaba, you're right next to it, on top of it. But since the given the lahavi balim b'shat sheila, you'd be chayav. So in fact, maybe the Braita is talking about where you're doing one melacha, which is what Rav Hamnuna said was a stipulation for being patur for ba'alav imo. It's really far-fetched. Hi, Mai. How can this be the case? If you told me that the Reisha is saying the owner is working in another field, right, or another job, but you're patur, right? And Seifa is b'oto malacha, the owner's working the same job, but you're chayav because of the order of borrowing the owner and the animal. Hainu rabuta, that seems to be a big chiddush. Right, rabuta means you added something. But if you're really saying that it's talking about where you have to be working in the same job, so my rabuta, what's so innovative? What are you adding in the Braita? Right? They're both basically doing the same malacha. Why is the Braita making a big deal that even if you're on it, even if you're not on it, being 20 feet ahead of it and being next to it is the same thing, right? So there's no real chiddush. And so therefore, this Braita seems to really say that you don't have to be working with the animal to be putter for Ba'alav Imo. So that's one question on Rav Hamnuna. And furthermore, there's another Braita which really throws out the whole second thing that Rav Hamnuna said, right? V'od Tanya, there's another Braita, remember, which says that you don't have to necessarily be there the whole time, which says, Mimashmash Nemar, this quotes the Braita. It says in the Pasuk, Im Ba'alav Imo lo yishalim. Look, if you borrow something, you have to pay. But if the owners are with you, you don't have to pay. That's a quote from the pasuk. So says the Gemara, any day I would know from there, right? I would understand that if the owners are not with you, you have to pay, right? So why does the Torah then say, so why does the pasuk say, it's actually an earlier pasuk, right? Why does it have to spell it out in both directions and say, if the owner's with you, you don't pay. If the owner's not with you, you do pay. Lomar lechatz is to teach you that, look, the only thing that matters is not the owner's with you the whole time. It's specifically to teach you that haya imo b'shat she'ila. If the owner's with you at the time you borrow it, they don't need to be with you when the animal gets injured, because it's just telling you that at the time you borrowed it, you didn't accept full responsibility because the owner was with you. But you never change that. You can't re-accept responsibility later. And if the owner's with you when it actually gets injured, that is not enough. It's still tzarich liot imam b'shat she'ila. The owner has to be with you at the time that you borrow it. So that is clearly against Rav Hamnuna, who says that the owner has to be with you from the beginning till the end. This Braita says the owner only has to be with you at the beginning. The Tanya Yiddich, and there's another Braita which seems very repetitive, but I'm going to read it as it is. It says, this now quotes the Braita, it says in the pasuk, Ba'alav ein imo. This is the earlier pasuk, Shalem Yishalem, right? So I would assume, why is the Torah saying if the owner is not with you, you pay? Ein yodeh, wouldn't I know? Shem Ba'alav imo lo yishalem, right? That if the owner um, with you, you don't pay. So why did the Torah have to spell that out? To tell you, and again, this is sort of repetitive, but speaking out in another way, that this is telling you that if the owner is with you at the time that you borrow the animal, that's enough to pater you. You don't need the owner to be with you at the time that it gets injured. And if but if the owner is with you when he gets injured, right? Yeah. No, I read sorry, I went backwards. I apologize. Keep reading. There's another Braita that says, from the fact that the Torah says if the owner is not with you, you have to pay. I would know that any addition that if the owner is with you, lo yishalim. Why does it say the second pasuk? Kivan shiyatzam rishut mashil sha'achat bebalim umeta patur. That once it's gone out of the possession of the lender for one moment, and at that moment the owner was with you, if it then dies 3 weeks later, you're patur, and that is tiyufta Rav Hamnuna tiyufta. Rav Hamnuna is wrong. So Rav Hamnuna made these rules, and it turns out that the Braita disagrees with Rav Hamnuna, and Rav Hamnuna cannot, of course, argue with the Braita, and so therefore Rav Hamnuna is incorrect. We are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines from the bottom. I'm going to keep going. I think hopefully everyone has more energy in them this Sunday. Says the Gemara now, the first word on the line, 7 lines from the bottom. Abaya savar like Rabbi Yoshaya. Right? We're going to see, and we've had this before, that there's different ways to understand the way psukim are written, how a vav is constructed, right? And Rabbiya holds about that. Not that, when the Torah says and something, does it mean and, or does it mean and or, as we discussed yesterday? Abaya holds like a Rabbi Shaya in that case, and he is entirely to the correct Rabbi Shaya. He explains the verses of Psukim like Rabbi Shaya. We'll see this all in a second. Rava who was a bar pluta of Abaya. Rav was an Amora. Several like Rabbi Yonatan, who's also an Amora. He holds like Rabbi Yonatan about how we interpret the psukim that say and. Umataritz the Rabbi Yonatan. What does this mean? It says when Abaya several like Rabbi Yeshaya. Umataritz the Rabbi Yeshaya. The pasuk says the following, right? Pasuk says that Ba'alav ein imo shalim yishalim. Okay, the owner is not with you. You have to pay. Now, pasuk seems to say Tama, the reason that you have to pay, according to Rabbi Yoshaya, remember that the Torah refers to the owner being with you when you borrow it, and the owner not being with you when it gets damaged. Okay, so Rabbi Yoshaya explains the pasuk according to Abaya that Ba'alav ein imo, if the owner is not with you, shalim yishalim time madaleta b'tirvayu. That seems to imply that you're putter if the owner is not with you at both times, right? Um, meaning at the time of borrowing or the time of the damage, right? Implying that ha ita bechada v'leta bechada, right? That if the owner is with you at one time, either, we think it means either the borrowing or the injury or the death, then you'd be patur, right? Because the Torah seems to imply that only if the owner is not with you at both times. Says Gemara, but how could that be? Haktiv, but the Torah says in Ba'alav imo, if the owner is with you, lo yishalim, which implies that the owner is with you at both times, right? The whole time. That is time at ita b'truvayo. That generally implies that the owner is with you both times, meaning both the borrowing and the injury. Implying that if the owner is with you with one and not the other, you would be chayav, right? So meaning it's really hard, according to Yeshaya, that the pasuk means both, basically, to understand how whether you're a putter if only one and not the other, right? So what this then teaches you, according to Abaya, is telling you that you really it's true. You don't need both. But it is haya imo b'shat she'ela. If the owner is with you when you borrow it, which is what we said already, eino tzarich liot imo b'shat shvura meita. The owner does not need to be with you at the time he gets injured in order for you to be patur. But if haya imo b'shat shvura meita, but if they are with you at the time that it's injured, that's not sufficient. Then they need to be with you. Tzarich liot imo b'shat she'ela. They do need to be with you at the time that it's borrowed. So that is the way, basically. Rav Abaya interprets it according to Rabbi Yeshaya. Rava, keep going. I'm going to stop here actually. So Rava tomorrow we're going to learn uses Rabbi Yonatan's logic to basically understand that you don't need both things when it says to try to understand the Torah's implying you don't need both, but which one do you really need? So how do we know that basically you are patur if you are with the owner at the time you borrow it, but you're chayav if you're with the owner at the time that it gets damaged? And we will pick that up tomorrow on the top of Daf Tzadi Vav. Have a good day, everyone. Thanks for joining.